Well, along with Bill Shorten, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen is the man who'll be tasked with selling Labor's economic vision to the Australian people. He joined me from Canberra just a short time ago. Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Tony.
Now, Bill Shorten had a free run after last year's budget. He's going to run out of material pretty quickly after this one, though, isn't he?
Not at all, Tony. Can I say the unfairness at the heart of the last budget very much remains at the heart of this budget. We see the $100,000 university degrees. We see the $80 billion worth of cuts to health and education. We see the cuts to family tax benefit. And it gets worse. Tony Abbott going back on his word to Australian mothers, taking away paid parental leave entitlements and insulting them in the process. The prejudice and unfairness at the heart of the 2014 budget lives on in the 2015 budget, and it gets worse. And we'll be making that point, but we'll also be painting a positive vision for the future.
I'll come to the positive vision. Let me just pick you up on that, though. I mean, even you'd have to admit that if you overlook the massive deficit, Joe Hockey's second budget is full of carefully targeted sweeteners to a wide cross-section of voters. I mean, do you really think you're going to be able to run the same arguments as you did last year?
Well, that massive deficit that you referred to is pretty hard to overlook, Tony, when you consider everything Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott told the Australian people about debt and deficit disasters and budget emergencies and fire trucks turning up to put out the deficit emergency, etc.
Well, he was talking about the deficit that you essentially left them with.
Well, he was talking about how he would deliver a surplus. And it comes to this point, Tony. Those Australians who may have had their doubts about Tony Abbott, weren't sure about his judgment, but thought, well, he'll be a responsible fiscal manager and he'll get us back to surplus, he'll have a plan, must now be scratching their heads and asking, what is the point of the Abbott government? If the Abbott government doesn't have a credible pathway back to surplus, doesn't have a plan for surplus, and is seeing the deficit double just in the last 12 months, what is the point of the Abbott government? But the unfairness for which they justified this deficit strategy, they justified being unfair with a plan to reduce the deficit down to zero, remains, despite the fact the deficit has no credible pathway back to surplus.
As you well know, though, Tony Abbott's been clawing back Labor's lead in the polls for several months now. If he actually overtakes you in the budget, the big attention is going to turn on to Bill Shorten's leadership, isn't it?
Well, let me say a couple of things, Tony. Of course, it's been a very unusual circumstance that the government's been behind for the last 18 months in Australian political history. That is a very rare event.
Well, would you admit they're very likely to go ahead in the next poll? Bill Shorten described the budget tonight as a pre-packaged or repackaged for opinion poll. So he's obviously anticipating the worst from his point of view. Well,
Tony, of course it's a politically crafted budget. As John Howard said, as John Houston said, it's a budget crafted for the next election, not for the future. I accept that completely. I make that point. And
so that means, that indicates it's likely to be popular among voters.
Well, it may or may not be, Tony. I'm not here to commentate on opinion polls. I'll leave that to you. I'll say this, though, Tony. We completely understand and accept that the next election will not be about entirely the failings of the Abbott government, as many and varied as they are. We need to earn the respect and votes of the Australian people. That's what we've been working towards. That's the policy development work we've been done. They're the announcements we've made and the announcements we've made tonight and we intend to make in the future.
Let's go to some of those announcements tonight. I mean, all Mr Shorten really outlined here were a range of new spending initiatives and one big tax on superannuation effectively to pay for them, I imagine. Is that how it works out? I mean, all those initiatives you put in place, are they going to be paid for by the superannuation tax cut?
Well, we've already...
Tax increase, I should say.
Well, a reduction in the concessionality and a fair and moderate tax on earnings, that is right, which we've outlined weeks ago as a part of a $14 billion plan over the decade to make taxation of superannuation more sustainable and fair. Let me say to you very clearly, Tony, the taxation treatment of superannuation earnings concessions is not sustainable. We can't afford it as a nation. The difference is, I'm prepared to be honest with you about that. Joe Hockey will lie to you about that.
Well, they may be, as you say, they may be wanting to do things like that themselves, but they're absolutely not going to, according to both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer now. And Tony Abbott's drawn the kind of battle lines for the next campaign now. His government's going to cut taxes, a Labor government will increase them. That's the bottom line, and you actually have given him ammunition with his superannuation tax increase.
No, Tony, what we've done is said that we will make taxation of superannuation fairer and more sustainable. We've said that, and that's if you like, a courageous thing to do, to be upfront about that. I accept that. Of course it is. It's the right thing to do. But we're not going to accept a lecture from Tony Abbott, who's increasing petrol tax, reducing the family tax benefit. Note the middle word in the payment, family tax benefit. As John Howard said, it's a tax benefit. To reduce it is, in effect, a tax increase, which is what Tony Abbott's trying to do. The deficit levy, the GP tax. And tax as a percentage of the economy goes up on Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey's watch every year under this budget, and is higher than it ever was under Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard. He wants a tax debate? Well, I'm happy to have one, Tony.
Let's go to the one tax cut that you've talked about, or Bill Shorten's talked about tonight. That's, you're now calling for a 5% tax cut for small business across Australia. How much is that going to cost? And when asked on numerous occasions tonight to give the modelling, the economic modelling for what this would do for the economy, Bill Shorten was unable to give an answer. Can you give an answer?
Well, the government has made the point that a 1.5% tax cut would stimulate investment and improve the confidence of the small business community. Guess what? We agree with that. But we think going further could have potential benefits as well. So what we've said tonight is to the government, if you want to go further, we're prepared to go on that journey with you. We believe in slower small business tax. We introduced the instant asset write-off in government. We proposed a corporate tax cut from government for small business. The opposition, the then opposition, rejected that and voted against it. We're not taking that approach. The instant asset write-off that they delivered on Tuesday night, that Joe Hockey was lauding, was one that he abolished just 12 months ago.
Well, OK then, if you're prepared to do a deal with the government, are you prepared to do a deal with the government to actually give them the resources, the money, the revenue to actually make a tax cut like that by addressing John Howard's middle class welfare initiative in family tax benefit Part B, which is there to be changed? If Labor agrees there's a lot of money there, why don't you make a deal along those lines?
Well, you talk about middle class welfare, Tony. We've already agreed to the change to the means testing. You want to talk about being constructive? We already voted for that. The change to the means testing down to 100,000. That's dealing with middle class welfare. What they are proposing now is not middle class welfare, Tony. They are proposing to take money away from families when their children is over 6. Not middle class, people on low and middle incomes as well. I completely reject your assertion that that is middle class welfare. That is a tax benefit which goes to people on quite low incomes, single incomes, right across the board. And what we reject is this ransom note that the government has made the budget to say we will only increase childcare payments by $3.5 billion if we can take $5.5 billion away in family tax benefit. They want to write a ransom note. We're not participating.
OK, where's the revenue that you're going to find to pay for a 5% tax cut? Or is this just some kind of Dutch auction where they offer a tax cut to small business and you say, oh, we can do better than that, but we're not going to tell you how we're going to pay for it?
Well, their package of tax cuts is $5 billion. They had no offsets. The budget papers themselves show that their decisions add $9 billion to the budget deficit because they are not saving as much as they're spending in this budget. So that is the standard they have set themselves. What we've said here is similar to what we said on superannuation. You'll recall, Tony, that I said to Joe Hockey and the government on behalf of the Labor Party, if you want to talk about fairer taxation of superannuation, we're in the conversation. We believe it should be done in a bipartisan fashion.
Can I ask you why? Let's just address that argument about fairness, because the strongest argument against your super tax is that people make preparations for their retirement years in advance. So if you suddenly impose a new tax, it has a retrospective effect on people who've been saving for years in anticipation that the rules would not change.
No, there is no retrospectivity to our approach whatsoever. It is entirely prospective. The earnings tax would come into force if we won office on the 1st of July 2017, only for earnings after that date. Any capital gains up until that date are completely grandfathered. The concession on the contributions tax is only prospective. You'd have an argument if we were changing withdrawals taxes or making retrospective changes. You'd have an argument there, Tony. We're not doing that. Everything we propose is entirely prospective, entirely future-looking. But the difference is we are telling people now what we will do in office. When I stand up and deliver Labor's first budget, if we win the next election, it will be to implement things we were honest about before the election. When Joe Hockey stood up to deliver his budget, he was announcing his policies, his election policies, for the very first time. It's the opposite of the approach I'll be taking.
Chris Bowen, we'll have to leave you there. Thank you very much for coming to join us tonight.
My great pleasure, Tony.